Picture this. It's 1959, and the most powerful car company on earth is about to commit corporate suicide. They're going to build a car so good, so revolutionary, that it terrifies them. And then, when that car threatens to expose everything wrong with American automobiles, they're going to kill it themselves. The weapon? A private investigator, some wiretaps, and one very angry lawyer who's about to change history. This is the story of the Chevrolet Corvair. And I promise you, it's far stranger than you think. General Motors didn't just build a car in 1959. They launched a revolution, and then they sabotaged it. Over the next decade, this single automobile would spark congressional investigations, create the modern consumer protection movement, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a car isn't how it drives, it's how much truth it reveals. So buckle up. We're about to dive into revolutionary engineering, corporate espionage, a congressional showdown that humiliated the world's largest company, and the tragic death of a car that was guilty of only one crime, being too far ahead of its time. Let's start at the beginning. But first, we need to understand what possessed Chevrolet to throw away every rule in the American automotive playbook. To understand the Corvair, you need to understand just how absolutely bonkers the late 1950s American car market had become. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors had spent an entire decade in a fever dream of excess, building chrome-laden behemoths with tail fins so sharp they were practically weapons. These weren't cars. They were land yachts with V8 engines that consumed gasoline like a drunk billionaire ordering champagne. 12 miles per gallon? That was on a good day, going downhill with a tailwind. These machines were enormous, expensive to run, and increasingly absurd for a country where families were flooding into the suburbs and actually needed practical second cars for commuting. The American auto industry was building vehicles for a fantasy world that was rapidly disappearing. And here's where it gets interesting. While Detroit was busy building automotive dinosaurs, the Europeans had quietly noticed an opportunity. Volkswagen, in particular, was absolutely printing money-selling Beetles in America. Small, cheap, fuel-efficient, and with the engine in the back where God apparently never intended it to be. By 1959, Volkswagen was moving nearly 200,000 cars a year in the United States. That's not just a lot of vehicles. That's a tidal wave of American dollars flowing straight to Germany. General Motors watched this trend with growing alarm. They needed a response, and not just another smaller car. They needed something genuinely different, something that could beat the imports at their own game. The man they chose to lead this mission was Ed Cole, Chevrolet's chief engineer and soon-to-be general manager. Cole was that rare creature in Detroit, a genuine visionary trapped inside a corporation that feared imagination like vampires fear sunlight. He'd already revolutionized the industry with the small block V8 that made the 1955 Chevy legendary. Now, he wanted to do something even more radical. His concept was elegant, almost too elegant for the American market. Put the engine in the rear, just like the Beetle. Make it air-cooled to eliminate the radiator and water pump. Use a flat-six configuration for a low center of gravity and silky, smooth operation. Build it as a unibody, still uncommon in American cars, to save weight and cost. The result would be lighter, more fuel-efficient, and cheaper to manufacture than any traditional Chevrolet. It was brilliant, but here's what made the Corvair genuinely revolutionary. It wasn't just a new model. It was a philosophical middle finger to everything Detroit believed. General Motors, the most conservative automaker on the planet, was essentially admitting that maybe, just maybe, the Europeans had figured something out. Maybe bigger wasn't always better. Maybe Americans wanted clever instead of just powerful. It was heresy, and Ed Cole was determined to make it happen. The first Corvair rolled off the assembly line in late 1959 as a 1960 model, and it was genuinely unlike anything America had ever mass-produced. That rear-mounted engine displaced 140 cubic inches, about 2.3 liters, and produced 80 horsepower in base configuration. Not impressive by American standards, but absolutely competitive with the imports it was designed to fight. The flat-six design created an unexpected benefit. Open the front hood, and instead of an engine, you'd find actual usable storage space. Some people started calling it a front trunk. The term would lie dormant for decades before Tesla owners would pretend they invented it. The styling was clean, almost European in its restraint. No excessive chrome assault. No tail fins that could impale pedestrians. Just smooth, uncluttered lines that would actually age remarkably well. Ed Cole and his team had created something that felt genuinely fresh in a market drowning in design excess. And for the first few years, America seemed to get it. The Corvair sold reasonably well. Not spectacularly, but respectably enough to prove the concept worked. Chevrolet moved over 200,000 units in 1960, the first model year. They got ambitious, expanding the lineup to include a station wagon called the Lakewood, a van called the Greenbrier, and even a pickup truck called the Rampside. By 1962, there was a turbocharged version pumping out 150 horsepower, which was genuinely quick for a compact car that era. The Corvair was becoming what Ed Cole had dreamed, a real alternative to conventional American cars. But there was a problem, a real one, and it was hiding in the physics. Here's the thing about putting a heavy engine behind the rear axle. Physics doesn't care about your revolutionary vision. When you load up the back of a car, you create what engineers call a rear weight bias. The back becomes heavier than the front, and this fundamentally changes how the car behaves when you're cornering, especially if you do something perfectly natural like lifting off the throttle mid-turn. In a conventional front-engine car, lifting off the gas causes weight to shift forward, pressing the front tires into the pavement and giving you more grip exactly when you need it. In a rear-engine car, it does the exact opposite. The weight shifts off the rear tires precisely when you need them most. The early Corvairs used a swing-axle rear suspension, common in European rear-engine cars of the era, including the Beetle. But here's the critical difference. The Corvair was bigger, heavier, and more powerful than a Beetle. And Chevrolet, in their infinite wisdom and cost-cutting zeal, had made some compromises that would come back to haunt them. The front suspension was softer than ideal, which meant the car had a tendency to understeer at first, pushing wide in corners, then suddenly oversteer if you lifted off the gas. Engineers called this tuck under, and it could catch inexperienced drivers completely off guard, transforming a routine curve into a white-knuckle moment. Now, here's what makes this story infuriating. This wasn't a secret. Enthusiast magazines noted the handling quirks from day one. Road and Track praised the car's overall concept, but warned that it required an attentive driver. The engineers at Chevrolet knew about it too. In fact, Ed Cole's team had actually developed a front anti-roll bar that would have significantly improved the handling characteristics. The cost? $15 per car. The decision? The accountants at General Motors said no. Too expensive. Not necessary. The customers won't notice. The customers noticed. Accident reports started filtering in. Stories of Corvairs spinning out, flipping over, losing control on curves that should have been routine. Were there other factors? Often yes. Worn tires, incorrect tire pressures, inexperienced drivers, bad luck. But the pattern was undeniable, and people were starting to talk. And then in 1965, a young lawyer named Ralph Nader published a book that would detonate like a bomb under the entire American auto industry. It was called Unsafe at Any Speed, and it didn't just criticize cars. It put the entire American automotive industry on trial. Nader's book was a comprehensive indictment of Detroit's attitude towards safety. He argued that car manufacturers consistently prioritized styling and profit over basic engineering that would protect drivers in crashes. He documented how companies knew about deadly flaws and did nothing. How they fought against seat belts, padded dashboards, and collapsible steering columns. All simple technologies that could save lives. But the chapter that grabbed America by the throat, the one that made the book a bestseller and launched a movement, was Chapter 1, the sporty Corvair, the one-car accident. If you've made it this far, you're clearly into this kind of deep dive. Quick question, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do stories like this every week. All right, back to Nader because what happened next changed everything. Nader's critique was surgical and devastating. He argued that General Motors had knowingly sold a car with dangerous handling characteristics, that they had rejected cheap fixes that would have made the car safer, that they had conducted their own internal studies showing the problems and then buried those studies, that they had put profits ahead of lives, consciously and deliberately. He cited accident reports, engineering studies, and heartbreaking testimony from people who had been injured or lost family members in Corvair crashes. He built a case that was impossible to ignore. The book became a sensation. It hit bestseller lists and stayed there. Suddenly, everyone in America was talking about car safety, and the Corvair became the symbol of everything wrong with Detroit. The poster child for corporate negligence. Here's the tragic irony. By the time Unsafe at Any Speed hit bookstores, the 1965 Corvair had already received a completely redesigned rear suspension that fixed the handling issues. The second-generation car introduced that same year was genuinely one of the best handling American cars of its era. Road and Track praised it. Car and driver compared it favorably to the Porsche 911. But none of that mattered. The narrative was set. The Corvair was the unsafe car, the killer, the cover-up. And then General Motors did something so breathtakingly stupid that it guaranteed their own destruction. When executives at General Motors learned that Ralph Nader was working on his book, they made a decision that would haunt the company for decades. Instead of addressing his concerns, instead of defending their engineering, instead of acting like a legitimate corporation, they decided to destroy him personally. They hired private investigators to dig into Nader's life. They tapped his phones. They followed him. They interviewed his friends, his former colleagues, people he'd dated. They asked questions about his political beliefs, his sexuality, his finances. They were looking for dirt, for scandal, for anything that could be used to discredit him before the book came out. There was no dirt. Ralph Nader was exactly what he appeared to be, a single-minded consumer advocate who lived simply, worked obsessively, and believed passionately in his cause. He wasn't hiding anything because there was nothing to hide. But the investigation didn't stay secret. When it came out that General Motors, the world's largest corporation, had been illegally spying on a private citizen who had dared to criticize their products, the backlash was immediate, explosive, and absolutely brutal. GM's president, James Roche, was summoned before a Senate subcommittee. On national television, in front of the entire country, he had to publicly apologize to Ralph Nader. It was one of the most humiliating moments in corporate American history, and it made Nader a hero, the crusading lawyer who had taken on Goliath and won. Think about what GM had just accomplished. They'd taken a book that might have been a minor controversy and turned it into a national movement. They'd transformed Ralph Nader from an obscure attorney into the most famous consumer advocate in America. They'd validated every single accusation in his book by proving that, yes, corporations really would do anything to protect their profits. It was a masterclass in self-destruction. Here's the genuinely tragic irony. By the time all of this was happening, the Corvair had already become a legitimately great car. The 1965 redesign had introduced a fully independent rear suspension that eliminated the handling quirks of the earlier models. The new Corvair was balanced, responsive, and genuinely fun to drive. Road and Track called it one of the best handling cars in America. Car and Driver praised its near-perfect weight distribution and predictable, controllable handling characteristics. Automotive journalists who actually drove the car loved it. But it didn't matter. The American public had made up its mind. The Corvair was the unsafe car, the one that killed people. The one that General Motors had tried to cover up and then tried to suppress by spying on the man who exposed them. Sales, which had already been declining due to competition from Ford's new Mustang, collapsed completely. From a peak of nearly 330,000 units in 1961, Corvair sales fell off a cliff. By 1969, they were moving just 15,000 units. General Motors pulled the plug after the 1969 model year. The Corvair was dead, and it wasn't coming back. But here's where the story gets really complicated. In 1972, 3 years after the Corvair went out of production, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration released a comprehensive study. They had compared the handling characteristics of the 1960 to 1963 Corvair to other cars of the same era. the Volkswagen Beetle, the Ford Falcon, the Plymouth Valiant, and others. Their conclusion? The Corvair was no more dangerous than comparable vehicles. Let that sink in for a moment. The handling quirks were real, but they weren't unique to the Corvair. They didn't result in a statistically higher accident rate. The federal government, the same government that had held congressional hearings about the Corvair's safety, concluded that the car wasn't actually more dangerous than its competitors. By then, of course, it didn't matter. The Corvair was already gone, its reputation permanently destroyed. The report generated a few newspaper articles and then disappeared into bureaucratic archives. Ralph Nader's book remained a bestseller. The Corvair remained a symbol of corporate malfeasance. History, as they say, is written by the winners, and the Corvair had lost. So what actually killed the Corvair? The truth is more complex than Ralph Nader's book, though that certainly didn't help. The more immediate threat came from inside General Motors' own family. In 1964, Ford dropped a bomb on the market, the Mustang. It was an instant sensation, a small, sporty car with a conventional front-engine layout, available with a range of V8 options at a price that made it accessible to young buyers. The Mustang created an entirely new market segment, the pony car, and sold over 1 million units in its first 2 years. It was everything America wanted: sporty, powerful, affordable, and most importantly, conventional. No weird rear-engine handling characteristics to worry about. Chevrolet's response was the Camaro, which arrived in 1967. But internally, there was a fierce debate. Should they position the Camaro as a Mustang competitor, or let the Corvair evolve into that role? The Corvair had already proven it could be a sports car. The turbocharged Spider and the new Corsa models were genuinely fun to drive, with handling that rivaled European sports cars at a fraction of the price. But the decision was made to go conventional. The Camaro would be Chevrolet's pony car, with a traditional front engine, rear drive layout that buyers understood. The Corvair would continue as a niche product for buyers who wanted something different. Except that niche got smaller and smaller as the bad publicity mounted and the Mustang/Camaro hype machine rolled on. There was also the brutal question of profitability. The Corvair's air-cooled flat-six engine required specialized tooling that couldn't be shared with other GM products. The unibody construction was more expensive than traditional body-on-frame. Parts couldn't be swapped between the Corvair and other Chevrolet models. As sales declined, the economics became impossible. By the late 1960s, the Corvair was a car without a purpose, too expensive to compete with economy imports, too unconventional for mainstream buyers, and too tainted by bad press to attract enthusiasts who might have loved it. GM kept it on life support for a few years, making only minimal changes before finally ending production in May 1969. The last Corvair, a gold coupe, rolled off the assembly line in Willow Run, Michigan. It was the end of an experiment that had lasted a decade and produced nearly 1.8 million cars. An experiment that had dared to imagine that American cars could be something different, something clever, something better. Ralph Nader's book made him famous, but it also launched an empire. He used the settlement from his lawsuit against General Motors for their illegal investigation into his personal life to fund a network of consumer advocacy organizations that would reshape America. He became one of the most influential activists in American history, pushing for seatbelt laws, airbag requirements, emission standards, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. He ran for president 4 times, most notably in 2000 when his Green Party candidacy arguably swung the election to George W. Bush in one of the closest and most controversial elections in American history. Nader never apologized for his chapter on the Corvair, even after the NHTSA study came out. He maintained that the early cars were dangerous, that General Motors had known about the problems and failed to act. Whether you agree with him depends on how you interpret the evidence and how much blame you assign to the car versus the drivers versus the corporation. Ed Cole, the engineer who had championed the Corvair, rose to become president of General Motors in 1967. He pushed for the development of catalytic converters and emission control technologies, recognizing earlier than most that the industry was headed towards stricter environmental regulations. He also championed the Chevrolet Vega, another unconventional compact car that would develop its own reputation for problems, this time related to the engine rather than handling. Cole retired from GM in 1974 and died in a plane crash in 1977. He was 67 years old, and with him died some of the last remnants of innovative thinking at General Motors. The Corvair itself has found an unexpected second life. The cars that were once considered dangerous are now praised by collectors for their clever engineering and distinctive styling. A well-maintained late-model Corvair, especially a Corsa or Monza convertible, can command prices that would have seemed impossible when these cars were considered automotive pariahs. There's something deeply poignant about that transformation. The Corvair was ahead of its time in ways that become more obvious with every passing year. It anticipated the downsizing and fuel efficiency concerns that would become urgent after the 1973 oil crisis. If it had survived just a few more years, if the bad publicity hadn't killed it, it might have found a whole new audience among buyers desperately looking for alternatives to gas-guzzling monsters. But timing, as they say, is everything. The Corvair arrived too early to benefit from changing attitudes toward fuel efficiency and too late to establish itself before the safety controversy erupted. It was caught between two eras, belonging fully to neither. The lessons of the Corvair are still being debated. For consumer advocates, it remains a cautionary tale about corporate priorities and the absolute necessity of government oversight. For automotive historians, it's a case study in what happens when genuine innovation meets market forces and public perception. For engineers, it's a reminder that even brilliant ideas can fail if they're not implemented properly and communicated effectively. General Motors never built another rear-engine car for the American market. The Corvair's failure convinced the company that unconventional engineering was simply too risky, too difficult to explain to consumers, too vulnerable to criticism. Better to stick with what people knew and expected. That philosophy has guided Detroit ever since, for better or worse. And that is the story of the Chevrolet Corvair. A car that dared to be different in an industry that punishes difference. A car that was killed not just by its flaws, but by the perception of its flaws, amplified by corporate paranoia and self-destructive arrogance. A car that, in the end, might have been vindicated by history, if only anyone had been paying attention when that vindication came. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard about the Corvair before this? What do you think? Was it really dangerous or just misunderstood? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.